gone in and uploaded the recording from Monday, but I will do that right after our class so that I make sure that those are up there. But I guess a few announcements here at the top. I will be finished grading everybody's Belly of the Beast paper in the next couple of days. So since we're not meeting, right? We're not meeting. You're not going to really see me as I'm grading those. Before you freak out about a grade, you should know a couple of things. The first is that I give everybody comments on their paper. So if you lose points for whatever reason, I try to explain that in the paper. What you need to do in order to see those comments is usually go back to the assignment link and click on the file. I use the Canvas system to grade them. So usually by clicking back on the file, your paper comes back up. So you should be able to see your paper, and then and then you'll see my comments as I leave them throughout the paper. If I'm not leaving comments throughout the paper, I at least put something at the end of the paper with general comments overall of the paper. If you, for some reason, can't see them, can figure out how to look at them, send me an email, and it's really easy for me to download your paper with my comments and send it to you via email. So after you look at my comments, and if it's still not clear, or if you still want to talk to me, send me an email and I'm happy to meet with you if we have time this week, or if not, in the next week to talk about, all right, what went wrong here, what you can do to get a better grade on the next paper, or simply, sometimes if you want to ask me to reevaluate the grade on the paper, I'm happy to look at it again. I can't promise anything. Usually a grade won't go up, but I'm happy to take another look if anybody wants to. So those are the things that you should know as you're getting your grades in. Most important part, I think, is to go in and take a look at my comments. Then if those need more clarification, then reach out to me and I'm happy to meet with anybody to talk about papers. Even if you can't come to my office hours, we can usually find a time to meet outside of those as well. You do have a discussion board post due at the end of this week, 5 questions. Most of these, let's see, so far you probably can only answer the first one, but we'll get the rest of them answered today, especially the one about discussing what's in the Margaret Sanger source. So let's get to it, right? Let's get back to the topic here. We were talking about, well, we were getting to talk about Margaret Sanger, but kind of some of the biggest difficulties in terms of people accessing birth control and being able to control the size of their families revolved around access to reliable methods of birth control, but also attitudes, general attitudes from the medical profession. The Association of American Doctors did not view birth control as a medical topic before the 1950s, and that's going to change, but just individual doctors and the profession as a whole didn't view it as something that they needed to be talking to patients about. So that also put a lot of barriers in terms of accessing the birth control that existed at the time. Yes, if you'll remember, I said there were methods that worked, things like the diaphragm and condoms, but they were just not being widely used. For a lot of feminists and a lot of women in general, the issue with the condoms was that it was a male control form of birth control, and they just wanted something that was female control, right? And then of course the laws, right? Looking back at that legally birth control was restricted in the US. On the other hand, if you had money, you can usually find ways around some of these restrictions. But these were major effects, especially for lower class and working class women. So Margaret Sanger, her name is a name you've probably heard of. So tell me, what do you know about Margaret Sanger?
Through the paper you gave us?
Oh, on the from the reading, or just from her overall? What do you know about her?
Yeah, she became a nursery. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, she saw her mom had a 18 pregnancy and 12 was live. Yeah, and she saw this, saw her mom die, and she said, "Okay, I have to do something about this with the young girls in the New York."
That's exactly it. Yeah, about how she gets started, even how, how this is an issue for her at all. And it's from that personal experience of seeing her mom go through all of these pregnancies, some of which did not, the babies would die. And just having this large family, right, and saw how it affected her mom and what a barrier it was for her. It affected her deeply enough that she ends up dedicating her life to providing access to birth control. How have most of you heard of Margaret Sanger? Because I'm like, most people have heard of Margaret Sanger, but no one wants to say it. She's the founder of Planned Parenthood. She was the founder of Planned Parenthood, and we'll get to talking about that in a second. But we can go back um, to the source that I assigned on her, because in here she's explaining a little bit more about what leads to her activism. So a lot of it was personal, right? Seeing, she describes, right, and here it says, Singer witnessed her mother's slow death, right, after 18 pregnancies. Um, what is it? She says only 11 of which were live births. What else does she say here about what her work was? She was a nurse in New York. And she starts off at first kind of catering to middle class families, right? But then what changes? Yeah. All right, I'll help you out. I'm like, if you haven't read that, it's a short article, but go back in and read it. Oh, someone's putting it in the chat. Alex says, yeah, she sees how poor people specifically struggled with pregnancies and children, and she saw a need for birth control as being desperately needed in poor communities. Yeah, she talks about how she would go in and talk to a woman who's giving birth, or who needs to talk to a nurse. And it turns out that the problems the person was having go beyond whatever the immediate medical need was. What she's seeing is people living in poverty, and needing much more than just, help giving birth. She says clearly there were other health issues, chronic issues, that were all being made worse because of the economic problems. People were having trouble getting jobs, keeping jobs, especially for women. If they had large families, they just were constantly pregnant and giving birth, and that had a physical effect on the body, and then a significant economic impact on the family as a whole, having more mouths to feed. And she describes how seeing poor families in New York struggle with feeding their families, struggle with giving birth, really politicize her, right? It makes her even more willing to dedicate her life to expanding access to birth control. She opened the very first birth control clinic in the United States illegally, because it was illegal at the time, but she did it in Brooklyn in 1916. So that part's important. A lot of what Singer was doing was flat out illegal. She knows this. She knows she's defying the law, and she's not doing secretly. Like, this was not a secret clinic that was clandestine and people didn't know about. This is out in the open. Part of what she wanted to do was to challenge these laws that made accessing birth control difficult or impossible for especially poor people. uh, she argued that the only way that motherhood should be voluntary, like 100% voluntary, that people should not be forced to. she says that the only way to achieve that, for motherhood to be completely voluntary, was for people to have access to birth control, right? To have the information they needed about how to prevent pregnancies and about the different methods that were available, right? She's not arguing for access to abortion. That was initially not part of her political goals at all. That will change later on, but for a majority of her life, Margaret Sanger was not an advocate of access to abortion. She felt like women would not need access to abortion as long as they were guaranteed access to birth control. She also didn't believe that abstinence was practical. She was seeing people just end up pregnant with pregnancy after pregnancy. And she said, abstinence is just not the answer here. The answer for her was information and access to methods of birth control. But she also saw the limits of the methods that were available, right? The fact that they weren't all female controlled, the fact that a lot of women didn't want to go in for the examination needed for the diaphragm, right? So she begins lobbying for an oral contraceptive, right? Something like a pill that women could just take and that would put women in full control of their reproductive lives. That was the goal for her, right? Now, this is a kind of marks a shift, right? These days, we don't focus so much on that element of it, on like, okay, the female control method. The discussion about birth control in modern times is more about, wait, why is it have to be 100% the woman that has to be in charge of the birth control? In a heterosexual relationship, and there are male methods of birth control that are being they're at the human trials now, and actually some have even proven quite effective. Has anybody kept up with any of the news about male birth control? No? I'm like, maybe I can talk about that later then. There are some methods that have been proven to be really effective on men. There's issues with some of the birth control that they are developing for men. One of the methods was seeing a lot of side effects in the men in the trials. And so they kind of that's not the one we're going to see. Another method that was proving really effective required an injection in the penis. And the minute people started writing about that method, men freaked out online about how they would never use that method. So there's clearly going to be barriers to that one. But there are pharmaceutical companies and doctors working on male forms of birth control. One of the main problems we're seeing, though, is the funding for some of this. There's a method that was developed, I forgot where, but it was not developed by a major pharmaceutical company. And in fact, this is why I don't even know a lot about it. Because oftentimes, it has to be developed, it has to have the backing, the money behind it in order for a method to become widely used and for people to have the information on it. Yes, Lily puts, I thought there was a more birth control method for men, but it's not widely used because they didn't like it. Yeah, the shot for men exists, but it's a shot that goes into the penis, and the thought of that just apparently freaks out a lot of men. But there's other methods that are currently working, but they don't have the backing of a big pharmaceutical company right now. And that's going to be the trick. That was also an issue for the birth control pill, right? There were several barriers to getting a birth control pill out there into existence. And Margaret Sanger was one of the few people actively asking that this method be created, right? It wasn't out there. And she is not a scientist. She wasn't a researcher. So she just thinks there has to be something that's as easy as a pill that can put the control in women's hands. But she needed to find people that were willing to do that. And we'll get to that in a second. She also a key part of her activism was making sure that it was the medical profession that needed to be in control of the birth control for women, that doctors and nurses were, she said, quote, the proper authority for dispensing contraceptive information and devices. So for her, this is something that people would have to go to the doctor and get, but they wouldn't need the same kind of exam they needed for a diaphragm, right? That was something that a doctor would write a prescription for, and then a woman could do at home. This is really important because remember, doctors don't want to have anything to do with birth control. But she's saying that doctors should be the ones in charge of birth control. Any idea why she would make that argument when she knows, she's a nurse, she's in the medical field, why she would make that argument knowing that most doctors don't think it's a medical issue? Any guesses? One part of it is she's a nurse, right? So she values the role of healthcare professionals a lot, right? She's a nurse, and so she thinks it's doctors and nurses who should be dispensing birth control. But it was also how shrewd she was about how she was making this plea for the availability of birth control. She knew that politicians would freak out if the access was completely up to women and not controlled by doctors in the medical profession. She thought they're going to say that birth control is just so that women can sleep around and have sex and not have to worry about consequences. And she said this way, by saying that it's going to be a medical controlled form of birth control, politicians are more likely to be in favor of it, right? And to make birth control legal by saying, this is not just going to be any woman anywhere can have access to birth control. It's all going to be controlled by doctors. And it turns out she was right. One of the big worries with the birth control pill was, what does this mean for women's role in society? If women can control, like if women can have sex without worrying about getting pregnant, does this mean women are just going to go crazy? Like they're going to lose all morality? And people didn't want that, right? Because they viewed sex as something that was for procreation only. And if it's for procreation only, then why do you need birth control? Now, morality was changing, right? And in the 1950s, Dr. Kinsey's, Alfred Kinsey's study comes out. He did a comprehensive study of sexuality in the United States. And what his study showed was that actually a lot of people were behaving in ways that were popularly seen as immoral, right? People were having sex for fun already. Like that was happening behind closed doors all over the place. There was also these abnormal sexual methods that were seen as immoral. And his study showed that actually lots of people were doing it. Things like anal sex and oral sex. Those were things that were viewed as like not things that like proper heterosexual couples did. But his study revealed actually a lot of people are doing it. In fact, most people are doing it. Heterosexual couples is not just for gay couples. Heterosexual couples are doing it. So things like that help to change the perception of what should be allowed and what's morally acceptable, because people find out actually everyone's doing it, right? So some things about Margaret Sanger, though. She was not a really nice person. I'm like, she's an incredibly important figure in the birth control movement. I mean, without her, I mean, she's the figure of the birth control movement. And the founder of Planned Parenthood, which still exists today and plays a big social, political role. But she was not a nice person. A lot of the people in her life end up having problems with her, especially her sister. She has a sister that was very active in the birth control movement. It was always the two of them. And the sister tended to get a lot of more publicity and more public attention because she was often doing crazy things, shutting down buildings, attacking politicians. She was doing kind of things that got a lot of attention. As a result, Margaret Sanger would get jealous of all the attention her sister was getting. So her sister at one point gets arrested, and Margaret Sanger doesn't bail her out. She's like, yeah, take her. Instead, what she does is she negotiates with New York State politicians, and they say, okay, let her go. And in exchange for no jail time, I promise you my sister will have nothing to do with the birth control movement. She will not participate in any demonstrations. She will not be involved at all. So she did all of this without her sister's consent. She basically gets her sister out of jail in exchange for her sister having nothing to do with the birth control movement. The sister got super angry at her, but the deal had been struck, and that, because that was the reason she was out of jail. So she basically forces her sister out of the birth control movement because she was jealous. So by a lot of different accounts, just not a very nice person. I keep waiting for somebody to ask me about eugenics and Margaret Sanger, because that's usually one of the controversial elements that comes up when discussions of her occur. And she was for a short time involved in the eugenics movement in the 30s. At that time, well, in the 20s and 30s. At that time, eugenics was the cutting edge of scientific research and scientific development at the time. And so she was involved in it for some time. You can also see from the document that I assigned how she would be interested in eugenics, right? She thinks like literally poor people are having too many kids. So what is the solution? Well, you need to try to stop poor people from having more kids. For her, the solution was birth control, and that overlapped with eugenics ideas of, hey, poor people, people of color, people with these undesirable genes should not be reproducing. Right? That was part of the eugenics ideas. And so the use, making birth control available to poor communities of color then has the overlaps with that eugenics ideas. She ends up leaving the eugenics movement. She does leave the eugenics movement, but there is no question that she was involved in some part. So when sometimes people try to attack Planned Parenthood today, they will use that history to attack Planned Parenthood. And now Planned Parenthood has been trying to do a better job of acknowledging that history and saying, yeah, our founder dabbled in eugenics, and it was a key part of that, and kind of acknowledging that. And so it's there. Another important element, though, to bring into that discussion is that while some people might be promoting birth control in poor communities of color, the reality was also that poor women of color wanted access to birth control. They wanted access. And once the birth control pill becomes available, right, they will go even to clinics that were associated with the eugenics movement, because what was more important to poor women of color was access to birth control as a way of controlling their lives and controlling their reproduction, the size of their families. So those are things to keep in mind, that both of those things can be true, that somebody could have both eugenic intentions, but also that the people that that the community that they were working in might have also just wanted access, period. So how does the pill get developed? This is an important part of the history. And initially, by the 90s and 30s, we had all of the science needed in order to create a birth control pill. What we didn't have was people doing research on it. It seemed like nobody wanted to do research to develop a birth control pill. Why? Why wouldn't any researchers want to be doing research on this? Any guesses? Someone's putting it in the chat. They'd be criticized. Ernesto, that's exactly it. It was too controversial. Nobody wanted to be associated or called like the researcher working on birth control. It was too controversial, right? They didn't want that kind of backlash or that kind of negative attention. But by that point, by the 30s and 40s, we'd figured out the physiology, the endocrinology of reproduction, right? Because we needed to figure out first how every aspect of reproduction in the human body worked in order to figure out an effective method of birth control. We'd also figured out, well, chemists had figured out how to synthesize a more powerful analog of the natural progesterone, because of what the birth control pill does is basically trick the body hormonally into thinking that that it's already pregnant, right? Or that there's, not getting pregnant. So the science was there. The knowledge was there. You still needed, though, a company willing to fund the research and the trials and all of that stuff. No company wanted to do it, again, because nobody wanted to be associated with birth control. But you had people like Margaret Sanger who were pushing for it. And they end up finding a company that's willing to do it, JD Seal, but they were willing to do it in large part because the funding was coming primarily from one single individual, Catherine Dexter McCormick. She was this wealthy feminist. She was had a close relationship with Margaret Sanger, and so it was Margaret Sanger, and Catherine Dexter McCormick who were really pushing for it. Right? But most of the money is coming from this one person. So, all right, they began doing all the research necessary to develop the pill. They get to the human trials where they're ready to start testing the pill out on actual people. And it was tricky because medical birth control was illegal in so many parts of the US. So where are you going to conduct these human trials? They end up doing them in Puerto Rico, right? So Puerto Rico is and was a US territory. So it's technically in the US, but also technically not. There was this gray area there where the doctors could go to Puerto Rico and conduct the trials there. Some of the doctors involved in the trials also had relationships with the hospital and the university in Puerto Rico. So that also contributed to the decision to do the human trials in Puerto Rico. Does anybody know, though, why those trials in Puerto Rico in particular were a problem? Why they were problematic? No, nobody's heard about this. So a lot of the women that participated in those trials are still alive today. So that could have been, Olavo says, the religious element, that could have been a problem in terms of doing it in Puerto Rico, because you have a large percentage of the Catholic population, but it turns out that was not the problem. The problem was with the way they conducted the trials. They went into Puerto Rico specifically because they had a community of people they could tap into that was low income, right, and low education. They wanted specifically to try the pill out on people who didn't have a lot of education and were low income. They said, because if we can get people with very little education to figure out how to use the pill, then it means it'll be easy enough for anybody to use the pill, right? So that you don't need a lot of training or education in order to use this method. what some of the women that participated in the trial also say, though, is that they were never properly informed about all the possible side effects. That is necessary, as we've now learned, right? Part of running an ethical human trial is informed consent, so that people know exactly what they're getting into and know of the potential negative side effects. Well, the women that participated in the Puerto Rico trials all signed consent forms, but some of these women didn't speak English, and some of them talk about how in the information they were given, they were never told that there was the risk of death and other severe side effects, which they ended up experiencing. We know of at least 2 deaths that were very likely related to the participation in the trials. So at least 2 women died, and it seems like their deaths were related to them taking part in the trial. There were a bunch of other women that experienced other health issues that were potentially caused by participating in these trials. This was initially a big deal, not because of the outrage of the trials. This actually, most of it gets buried under the rug, and nobody, like, there's no investigation of it. There's no criminal procedure or anything happening here. But one of the tricky parts about hormonal birth control is that it's hormonal. So when you are affecting hormones in the human body, it's going to have an effect. And initially, you need to get the dosage right, or the hormone levels in the pill. And so a lot of the first people, once the pill goes on the market, there were a few people that were experiencing side effects because the dosage wasn't right. And so as a result, the newspapers talk a lot about it. They make it seem like it's something dangerous to take birth control. It turns out that actually didn't stop people from wanting to use the birth control pill, but there was initially some issues with getting the hormone levels of the birth control pill correct for the patient. And but anyways, even they get, they make the adjustments they need to make, and by May 1960, the FDA approved the hormonal birth control pill to be made available for prescription, via prescription, for contraceptive purposes, for the purpose of limiting conception, like preventing pregnancy. So it's a big it's a big deal. So how do you think the public is going to react to all of this? Just the general public. Is this going to be a great development, or not so great of a development? Like, guess. And you're guessing not. Actually, the opposite. Initially, even despite the controversy, right? There was a lot of controversy initially about how dangerous is it to be on the pill. So there was all these reporting on, like, ooh, what's the dangers of it? But that actually, all of that publicity around the dangers of birth control actually helped make the public aware of this new method. And initially it was received really well by a lot of different professions. Like at the time in the 60s and 70s, one of the big issues that people were talking about was overpopulation, right? About how the world was being overpopulated, there's too many humans, and this is the beginning of the environmentalist movement at this time. So this was seen as a game changer in terms of population control, right? If we can control the size of families, then maybe we can keep the human population in check, right? So welcome development there. Um, I already talked about the eugenics movement, so I'll skip that for a moment, and I'll come back. I'll come back to the issue of the popularity of it, but it's actually going to be very well received by a lot of people. Right, but I want to take a pause and come back to the one of the themes that I was talking about on Monday, which is, okay, who's allowed to be part of this movement and who's not, right? The suffrage movement, right, had initially been very limiting in that, one, the suffrage movement was fighting for one thing and one thing only, right? They were arguing for women getting the right to vote. But they were also leaving out women of color, purposefully pushing women of color out of leadership roles and forcing them to make their own organizations, right? Well, a lot of this had to do with how they were making their case for the women to vote to politicians and to the American public. They were very picky about the women they were recruiting into the suffrage movement. It had to be women that typically were middle class and were in good standing in the community. Why would they be interested in middle and upper class women? Why would the suffrage movement not be interested in poor and working class women to join the movement?
Can you repeat, please?
Yeah, why would the suffrage movement be only recruiting middle and upper class women and ignoring, not wanting to recruit poor women?
I guess because of the poor, you can direct it for right or left, yeah, and then well, they're more conscious with there's a bias, yeah.
Yeah, so that's a good that's good to bring up. Yeah. Ernesto in the chat says public image. Yeah. A lot of it is they didn't want politicians and the public to view the suffrage movement as a bunch of crazy women. I mean, that was still kind of their image, but they were very particular because they didn't want to be seen as just a bunch of crazy women. And so the women that they recruited needed to look good. They needed to look feminine and dress feminine. So even though there were women who were not, didn't have that feminine aesthetic as part of the movement, they were particular about recruiting feminine women. Because one of the attacks on feminists was that it's just a bunch of women who have penis envy. They want to be like men, and they're trying to behave like men. Right? And that scared politicians and the American public into thinking, wait, what is happening with these women actually? Are they just some abnormal, crazy women? Right. So instead, the suffrage leaders wanted their movement to be seen as a middle class, respectable movement. And they believed that you couldn't achieve that, that they couldn't be seen as respectable if they had too many working class women and they had too many women of color. And so that is part of the reason why they were keeping these women out of the movement, or trying to keep them out of the movement as well. So, as much as we want to celebrate women who are fighting the right to vote, I think it is also fair to criticize the fact that they were a primarily white middle class movement, right? And that the working class and women of color ended up having to form their own organizations. Still wanted the same thing, still wanted to work for the vote, but they were being left out. And we typically call that politics of respectability, right? You want people who look and will appear respectable to politicians and to the American public so that the movement is seen more positively.
That was the idea. The same thing then gets rolled over into the contraception movement. Like this idea of no, 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 we want to prevent criticism of our movement by looking a particular way. We need to look like we are respectable and feminine. Though, like that femininity was a really important part because of how these movements were getting criticized as a bunch of crazy women that just wanted to be like men. So, um, so this is why Margaret Sanger is always very particular about talking about birth control and wanting to make it a medical issue, saying this is for doctors, this is for women to be talking to their doctors about. That was very important for her. It's also probably why she was interested in kicking her sister out of the movement. She saw her sister as too radical, like literally too radical, too crazy, looking for the movement. She wanted it to be specifically look like a middle class women's issue that included men in there. Right? Even though the population she was more interested in helping was a working class communities. Right? That's initially this is where she ends up placing her clinics are in poor working class and communities of color. But this ends up being a big deal. It's still a big deal, even when you look at any social and political movement today, that the ideas matter, but what matters also is how an argument is presented to the public and who the leaders of a movement are and whether they come off as like nice people as opposed to like troublesome people. I would argue it's still these politics of respectability are still very much there. And for what Margaret Sanger would have said at the time is, I'm being strategic. And she would have said, I'm doing what I have to do to change the law and make a difference in people's lives. But the end result was that a lot of women of color and poor women were being left out of the contraception movement as well. In fact, the contraception movement was completely ignoring some of the eugenics issues. Right? Like even after Margaret Sanger leaves the eugenics movement, right? So she realizes it's not for her. She leaves the eugenic movements, but why isn't she talking about, for example, the forced sterilization that was occurring in public hospitals? Right. At this point, there was already forced sterilizations of Latina women, of Black women, and I forgot to put it in here, but Indigenous women were facing significant barriers to accessing health as well. Right. And because of the treaties between different Indigenous groups and the US government, Indigenous women were having to go to public hospitals to do this, to access health care. And Margaret Sanger and the birth control movement is ignoring those issues. This does set a kind of precedent because even today, when talking about birth control issues, these things tend to get left out. And when talking about access to contraception and abortion, there are some organizations that are trying to do a better job of talking about these things, but they're not mainstream issues. They're issues that just don't tend to form part of those discussions. And it has this history that's connected to very racist attitudes on the parts of feminist leaders. Here we go. So talking about the birth control, despite the kind of racist and sexist attitude of the people who are advocating for the birth control pill, the birth control pill comes into widespread and really quick acceptance.
It is accepted really, really quickly. From 1960, when it becomes, when the FDA approves it for a prescription, to 1965, the number of people that begin using the birth control pill skyrockets. It just skyrockets. And that's for three main reasons. Right? One, doctors were willing to prescribe it. All of a sudden, doctors are very interested. If a patient came to them and asked them for the birth control pill, yeah, no problem. A large part of that is they didn't have to do a physical exam.
These days it's different, but at the time, doctors saw this as a workaround around having to do those intimate physical exams of women. So they're like, yeah, okay, this is so much easier than having to fit somebody in for a diaphragm. So off they go. Here's the prescription, and people had access to birth control pills. So doctors accepting it and being willing to prescribe it to their patients is a big part of why so many people begin using it and why it has such a swift acceptance. Another big element is those Planned Parenthood clinics. At this point, Margaret Sanger had Planned Parenthood clinics in different parts of the country. And I mean, she was key in developing the pill. So there's Planned Parenthood endorses it right away, and they make it available at subsidized rates for their patients, meaning their doctors are prescribing the pill and offering it at a low cost to people coming into the Planned Parenthood clinics. Right? This is still one of the main things that Planned Parenthood does in communities, is provide access to birth control at a low cost or no cost to people. So the fact that people know about the pill, right, because it's been controversial, people are talking about it, doctors are willing to prescribe it, and even low income people had access to it via Planned Parenthood clinics. Is a big deal. It just is, right? And I'm kind of hinting at the third reason is people knew about it. Right? That's the number one barrier for a lot of things sometimes is, do people know that they can access this? Do they know that this exists? Right? And because of all the controversy about it, because newspapers and magazines were talking about it, it turns out it did the publicity for it. The company that had backed the development of the birth control pill didn't even have to do very much marketing for it. It was all being done by the public discussions of it. And I can't emphasize how big of a deal these things are, because you see what happens in countries where you don't have these three elements. So for example, in France, the birth control pill gets developed in 1960, becomes widely available in the US and in Britain. And it's pretty much, in the 1960s, it's pretty much only Britain and the US where you have such a large number of people using it. Even in other places in Western Europe, there was not access to it. So France, for example, in France, they legalized birth control in 1967. And then there's not a huge uptick of people using it. Why? Because there's no advertisement for it. No advertisement, no government program to let people know that it's available. It was also not being covered by the national healthcare system in France. They have a kind of universal health care there, and it was not being covered by the system. And so doctors weren't prescribing it, patients were not asking for it. And so there's not a significant rise in people using the birth control pill in France. It's not going to be until the 1970s that people in France began using the birth control pill in larger numbers. At that point, people in the US were already widely using the birth control pill because They knew it existed. Doctors were prescribing it, and clinics like Planned Parenthood were making it available at an affordable price. Right? So I'm like, it's a big deal. This is why I'm asking you about this in the discussion board post for the week. This is still part of the issue, or part of the reasons why you see other places in the world, some countries where it's not in widespread use. Religion also tends to play a significant role in heavily Catholic countries. There is less widespread acceptance of birth control, although that has been changing, but in heavily in practicing Catholic countries, religion can be a big issue. In the US, it turns out, even despite the Catholic Church's ban on any kind of medical birth control, in the US, what starts happening in the 60s and continues into today is that most Catholics use some form of birth control. And that also seems to be part of like Catholic tradition in the US of like just ignoring the Catholic Church on this topic. Like, there are methods that the Catholic Church allows, like the rhythm method, the tracking of a menstrual period, but Catholics are just as likely as other religion to use the birth control pill or other methods. I should say, since this class, I mean, like when I talk about these topics, it becomes a little bit of sex ed class. There's now more methods, right? There's the IUD, there's the patch, there's the shot. There's a lot more different kinds of methods today, but a lot of that it becomes available, possible with the widespread use and acceptance of the birth control pill. Now, how big of a deal is this? Because I've been talking about how significant this all is, right? The development of the pill is so significant. But now I want to pause and question my own argument. How significant is it really? Because one of the problems is still an issue of healthcare, access to healthcare, right? So if you don't have access to healthcare and to doctor, then you might not even today be able to have access to birth control, to a reliable method of birth control. If you don't have health insurance, it's an issue. But even at the time, people questioned how big of an impact is birth control in the lives of women specifically, but in the lives of people overall. Any ideas? There's no wrong answer here. I'll tell you, it's people debate this question. How significant is it? Because on the one hand, the birth control pill finishes separating sex and procreation, right? With the availability and acceptance of the birth control pill, sex did not need to be about procreation only. It was like the last straw. That's it. You don't have, if you're not afraid of that, until the issues of STD and AIDS and HIV comes up later. But this time it's like, aha, I don't have to be afraid of it. So sex can be about many other things. And women, and for a woman, it meant, aha, I can focus on my career instead of starting a family right away. However, what other women said was, okay, this is nice. This is really great to be able to control when and how many children I have, but it doesn't significantly change my life. What some people said was, I still, one, am responsible for the children. Why are women still responsible for taking care of the children? Why aren't men stepping up more?
Now, not only do I need to have a career, but also need to take care of the children. What some women experience was just, wait a minute, my job just doubled. Now I just have double the work. And how beneficial is this still? Right? If I still don't get paid the same as the men in my company, if I don't seem to have the same equal rights and social status, how big of a deal is the pill then? What do you say? How big of a deal was it? What if I don't let you leave the Zoom until you tell me? Big deal, or, ooh, I see the point about things didn't change significantly enough for people. No? Somebody, I know some of you still think it's still a big deal. Lily says, I think it's still a big step to get there despite the other issues that remained. Yeah. All right. Lily has just saved the rest of you. And that's the thing to remember. Okay, one thing gets done and like, okay, doesn't mean it ends the rest of it. Let's see, Alex says, in that sense, I believe that it is significant because in more recent times, women have been speaking about their own pleasure freely without feeling ashamed or scared that separation of sex and children is what drove a woman into standing up. Yeah, that in terms of how we view human sexuality, it does open up the doors. And it opens up the doors to re-examining human sexuality, to examining how we define family, how we view homosexuality. Right? It does open up some doors there. And it maybe starts putting some cracks in patriarchal structures, right? It didn't make the patriarchy go away. Patriarchal structures remain. But what Alava was saying in the chat is maybe it's right beginning to crack that structure. Yeah. So one more thing before I let you go. I have my last question in the discussion board post is about Wonder Woman. Oh wait, Lily says, we can't diminish the things we do accomplish just because there are more things to do. I think there needs to be a balance between celebrating the wins, no matter how big, and then still working to fix other problems. Lily, are you a history major? A very history major kind
No,
of.
I'm a bio major.
Okay. I'm like, well, if you ever want to, well, bio majors don't have time for any other minor or anything else, but that is a complete, these kinds of answers are great because it's yes and no. Historians, history professors love those kinds of answers. Okay, so what does Wonder Woman have to do with birth control? Does anybody know? Who knows their Wonder Woman history? Who knows their DC comic history? Nobody knows? Everything. Wonder Woman has everything to do with birth control. Wonder Woman was created by Professor William Moulton Marston. He was a failed professor. He actually went from job to job and ended up not making it as a professor. But he's known for a couple of things. One, he developed, or he gets credited with developing the lie detector test, right? So in fact, her Wonder Woman's lasso of truth exists because this was a big deal for him. He developed the lie detector test, and he's like, Wonder Woman will have this lasso, wrap you around it, and you have to tell her the truth. So he gave her that because of that.
He also, if you watch, there's been a movie about him done recently that he kind of had a controversial, I guess, a little bit controversial relationship because he was in a polyamorous relationship with two women, with Elizabeth Holloway, who was his legally his wife, but also with Olive Byrne. And you might not never have heard of Olive Byrne, but Olive Byrne was Margaret Sanger's niece. And so through his relationship with Olive, Marston was very aware and very involved in the birth control movement. He donated money to them. Byrne was active within the birth control movement. And he says when he was interviewed that in order to fully understand Wonder Woman, you had to understand Margaret Sanger. As he said, what he saw in the birth control women, in the birth control movement and in the feminists of the time, was how patriarchy would hold back women. And so when he sets out to create Wonder Woman, he wanted to create somebody who was not being held back by any of the things that regular women were held back by. So this is why he makes her being born and raised in an island far away from society. And it's a women-only, women-led society, right? The Amazons. It's based on some history and legends, but that's why he has her being born and raised by the Amazons, because that way, when she encounters the society, the patriarchal society, she doesn't get held back by it, right? Like she doesn't have doubts about herself in that way. Wonder Woman does. No, she's a confident, self-assured woman. And that's what he imagined would be the woman of the future, a woman that would not be held back by these patriarchal structures and based on the ideals of feminists at the time, right? She was also designed by a bunch of men, like the initial group of comic creators and designers that worked on the Wonder Woman comics were all men. This is also why you see her wearing like very short, revealing outfits, because they wanted her to be confident, powerful, but also good looking and sexy. So it's like a feminist version. She's a feminist icon filtered through the eyes of men. Right, because it's a man design who created her, and the early designers were all men. But this idea of like, she's designed in this period in which the birth control movement is a big deal, and he felt the creator that to fully understand her, you had to understand the politics of the day and people like Margaret Sanger who were fighting for women's rights. There's also a lot of like cute little tidbits, like her bracelets were designed from Olive always wore bracelets. So a lot of elements in her costume he borrowed from things that the women in his life wore. But okay, I will stop.